Hi, I'm Matt Pizzarella, Director of Corporate Communications with Range Resources. We're a natural gas drilling company. By now, I'm sure almost everyone has heard of the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania, which is now the largest producing natural gas field in the United States. Believe it or not, our company, Range Resources, pioneered the Marcellus Shale back in 2004. It's been that long. We also pioneered the Upper Devonian and Utica shale wells back in 2009. This is now an industry that supports about 250,000 jobs here in Pennsylvania. It provides hundreds of millions of dollars in lower energy prices and well over $1 billion in tax generation for the Commonwealth. But the important question that everyone always asks is, how do you do it? How do you get the gas out of the ground? So we're very excited to be able to show you all the phases of development. The whole process takes about a year, but we're going to see a drilling rig, a couple of different drilling rigs. We're going to see the completions of the well, or what we call a frac job, as you probably may have heard. Then we're also going to go to a completed well site, or what we call production. So you'll see what the final product looks like for many, many decades. And last but not least, how does that gas then go to homes and businesses to fuel our lives? So hopefully you enjoy the tour and learn a little bit more about natural gas development here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Before the drilling of a Marcellus Shale well ever takes place, there's a lot of science that also takes place. In fact, before we even move a blade of grass, there's an extensive amount of science and technology that goes in on the front end. So what we want to know before we ever go out and make these huge investments, one drilling pad, for instance, could represent upwards of 60, maybe even $70 million in upfront capital that we invest. So before we go out there, we want to make sure that where we're drilling is going to work, that it's going to be productive, and that it's going to work efficiently. We can study the Marcellus Shale as well as the Upper Devonian and Utica shales by magnifying it tens of thousands of times, looking at the organic content that's inside that rock, and also understanding the subsurface and the strata heading down so that our drilling can be as efficient as possible. Then most importantly, we also want to understand the surrounding surface and the topography, because that's where environmental protection and controls come into place. Now, in Pennsylvania, we have among the most complex regulatory formats in the United States, and that's not a bad thing. It's complex in Pennsylvania because of the unique topography and seasons that we have. Pennsylvania has more surface waters than any state other than Alaska. So with that comes a greater analysis and understanding that has to be taken into account. So that could be spill prevention, that could be an emergency preparedness plan, and really it's the erosion and sedimentation controls that go into how we construct these locations. Now what we're looking at in front of me wasn't put together for dramatic effect, but this is literally a general look at some of the regulatory paperwork that needs to be filed before we can ever even move out and move a blade of grass. So beforehand we have to tell the DEP, for instance, where we're going to get all of our water, where we're going to get it, how we're going to transport it, how we're going to recycle it, and where it's going to go from there. That is all manifested regularly and audited by state regulators. We also have to tell them how we're going to build and construct these locations. There's an extensive amount, how we're going to build the wells, construct the wells. There's an extensive amount of title work that also has to take place on the local level. And last but certainly not least, there's a number of federal statutes that also extend beyond that. In Pennsylvania, we also have the unique part that makes us a commonwealth, which is we have an extensive amount of municipalities and local governments. For Range, that means there are several hundred local units of government that all have different requirements that they require of drillers. So we can do things like sound studies, traffic pattern reports, road bondings. All of these things require months of planning. For Range, the planning process can, in some instances, for one well, begin 3 years in advance. And it all starts in a room just like this. When you're looking at the subsurface, you're looking at the regulatory framework that you're about to work in. All of that has to take place before we ever go out and construct the location, before we drill the well, frack the well, and bring it on to completion. That entire process can take about a year, but it all starts right here. An important part of drilling a Marcellus Shale well is all of the care and attention that goes into the actual construction of the wellbore. It's a long-term investment. It's going to be there for a very long time. So now you get to see up close and personal how these wells are constructed. what we see is we start off with our 20-inch water casing string. So this piece of steel pipe is set up specifically designed to protect the water table. You'll notice each one of these strings has a centralizer as well at the top. It helps keep these units in place. Each one of these casing strings is set to a specific depth, and that's based on the unique geology in each specific area. So for instance, at this location, you can see the water pipe goes down as deep as 401 feet. And that's based on the depths of the nearby water table. We want to make sure that that's protected. Inside of that, we then set our next mine string, the 13 3/8 casing. And that's because there's a lot of mining in this area. We want to isolate that coal zone from our well bores. Again, that goes inside of the water string. After we set the mine string comes the intermediate string. You'll see that it's at 9 5/8. So that goes inside. So now we're in 3 different layers of specialty steel. And last but not least, the most important string that we use is the production string, which is 5.5-inch steel casing. In this case, that was set all the way down to 12,312. That's the total depth that string will be set at. So that includes both the vertical as well as the horizontal portions. So now let's take an up-close look. Let's see all these strings set together as well as the cement that goes into each line. All right, this is a really cool model because what it shows is actually how a Marcellus Shale well is constructed with the various levels of casing strings as well as the all-important cement that sets each one of these strings in line. So we saw all that pipe individually. This is what it looks like constructed. What we start off with is actually this first 26-inch line. We set that in the very first, say, 40 feet of the well. That's to hold the dirt back just so we can begin the construction until we hit the heavy stone. Again, you saw that 20-inch water line. We go up to our coal line, the intermediate string, and then the final production casing. And as you'll notice, each one of these layers is fully encased in specialty cement. So this is cement that is tested throughout the process, circulated through the entire wellbore to set each one of these strings into place. People often wonder, how do you get the cement through the sides? And in short, when we drill these wells, there's a little bit of open space around the outside of each steel line. After we set those, we pump cement all the way through to the bottom of that line. That cement then recirculates on that outside, filling in that space on the outside of each casing string. Again, when it's all said and done, you have multiple layers of fully encased specialty steel and cement. On an average well, there may be 3 to 4 million pounds of steel and concrete. We do this for a number of reasons, predominantly to make sure that we properly produce oil and natural gas out of these wells. But for most citizens in the Commonwealth, they want to make sure that their groundwater is protected. We want to make sure that that groundwater is protected as well. And what you see is multiple layers of impervious steel and cement, which is tested throughout the process to ensure that that groundwater is protected and that the well bores can produce for many, many decades into the future. What we're going to do now is take a look at the various drill bits that we use in the process. What we see here is a roller cone or a tri-cone bit. This is really the same drill bit that's been around for many decades. It's predominantly used in the vertical portion or the air drilling part of the Marcellus well. Again, based on where you are in the United States or in the world, you may use different drill bits. In the Marcellus, this is the first bit that we use. Again, relatively standard engineering design that's been around for many decades. The next bit that we use is a PDC bit. This bit has been specially designed, made of synthetic diamonds to ultimately shave the various levels of the shale. This is used predominantly in the horizontal portion of the well. The mud that we pump down through the wellbore comes through these nozzles and is used to keep that drill bit cool, to circulate those cuttings back up, and to rotate it. Again, picture each one of these diamond heads is shaving those various levels of shale from each formation and then circulating that back up to the top. Right now we're getting an up-close look at some of the different hammer bits that are used for the vertical portion of drilling a Marcellus Shale well. Like anything else that you would do around your house, it's really the same sort out here. You need the right tools for the right job. So what we see here are varying sets of hammer bits for all the different casing sizes that we set in those well bores. Each bit was specially made for the specific type of drilling, formation drilling that is taking place here in the Marcellus. Again, these are hammer bits that have been used over many decades in the oil and gas industry, and they continue to be incorporated here at Marcellus Shale locations. After the construction of the actual drilling location, this is really the first real activity that you see at a Marcellus Shale location. What this is called is the vertical rig, or an air rig, because it uses air to drill down. What we see behind us is approximately a 52-foot drilling rig. Very similar to the rigs that have been drilling for decades in Pennsylvania. In fact, this is a Falcon drilling rig, company based out of Indiana, Pennsylvania. And this rig was actually manufactured by another company called Schramm, which is just outside of Philadelphia. These rigs drill the vertical portion of the wells. And the reason why we utilize these is because they're more cost efficient than using the larger rigs that drill the horizontal wells. So these are the rigs that get the wells ready. It can move from each vertical well on the pad before the horizontal drilling portion takes place. What they do is they set the majority of the casing strings. Those are the different layers of steel that are cemented into place to protect the wellbore and isolate fresh water zones, cold zones, and other sections of the wellbore. These crews, like any other drilling rig, work around the clock in 12-hour shifts. This is a process that may take a couple of weeks, depending on how many wells are on the location, before this rig tears down and moves on to another location. The crews right now are setting the intermediate string of the wellbore. Again, what you'll notice is the crew's working to set that string, again, part of the process. And while these are the same kind of rigs that you've seen in Pennsylvania, it has a lot of the modern bells and whistles that we use from not only a safety and efficiency perspective, but environmental containment. This still uses the same closed-loop drilling system, spill containment system, as well as the methane burner units. So if we encounter any methane while we drill these wells, it's safely burned on the location, which is good from not only a safety perspective, but an environmental perspective as well. So our air rig has just broken down and left, finished drilling the vertical portions of this drilling pad. The rig behind us now is drilling the horizontal portions. So let's get an up-close look and let's see how this operation works. So now you get to see this specialty horizontal Marcellus Shale rig up close and personal. Again, the vertical portion of that well has already been drilled. What you'll notice starting off at the bottom is the pipe rack. Either the drill pipe or the casing is set in that rack. It's then lifted through the rig itself up into the derrick. Each one of those strings or pipe is then set down through the Marcellus as it drills, again, the horizontal portion of the well. What we see here are some technologies that were really pioneered and developed here in the Appalachian Basin in the Marcellus. Many of these are now best practices that other states and other formations are looking to use more of. Again, it's based on the individual topography and ecosystems in those states. But in Pennsylvania, these are standard operating procedures. Again, you'll notice the liner, multiple layers of specially designed liner to ensure that anything that may spill from a piece of equipment is properly contained. Also, this location incorporates a closed-loop drilling system. Those cuttings, which are carried back up through the surface, are recycled and reused. That mud is then sent back through this system. The cuttings are stored in the steel bins before they're taken to an approved facility. In this case, in Pennsylvania, oftentimes those are landfills. In other parts of the country, and it's something that's being studied in Pennsylvania, those cuttings have a beneficial use. More times than not, they can be used as road base. And in a state with a D- infrastructure rating, any additional use for infrastructure that would save us money and benefit the Commonwealth and in turn taxpayers would be a win-win situation for everyone. Last but not least is the burner unit that we use here. That's used for two primary reasons, not only for the safety of the workers in the location, but from an environmental perspective. There's greater concern over the potential for methane emissions as we drill through each one of these layers. It's important to know that that methane is safely collected and it's burned on the location. If you looked at the unit itself, you wouldn't know whether it was burning or not. It's an enclosed unit and it's similar to the pilot light in your stove. Again, we do that for not only a safety, but for an environmental perspective. Last but not least, in real time, as the crew is drilling these wells, we're able to monitor these wells as they're being drilled. The precise nature of this technology is second to none. Picture, if you would, if you had a basketball and you buried it 2 miles deep and 2 miles off into the distance, these drilling rigs and our crew and engineers could pinpoint and hit that basketball. Not only would they be able to do it with accurate precision, but they could tell you when they were going to hit that basketball. And it's because they use a combination of state-of-the-art downhole technologies that are used, which can actually interpret pulses that is sent down that drilling mud. It also correlates in the magnetic pool of the earth, as well as the calculations of each formation that you drill through. All of that is then shored up through human beings that actually monitor what the computers tell them. A really cool, interesting point of what we use here is the downhole drilling motor. People have a lot of interest in how those units work. They always ask us, how do you drill these wells horizontally? It's not an abrupt 90-degree bend. It's actually a slow, gradual bend that's built over several hundred feet. And because of that 1-degree bend on the bottom of that drilling unit, our guys or gals can turn that bed any which way they want to steer the wells. Again, it's very precise technology utilizing a combination of engineering technology as well as state-of-the-art computer technology to make sure that these wells are drilled as efficiently as possible. Again, this is a process that may last a few weeks before it breaks down and moves on to the next horizontal wells at the next Marcellus Shale location. By now, almost 10 years into the Marcellus Shale development, a lot of people have seen drilling rigs. There's a couple of misconceptions with those rigs. First of all, they think the rigs are there forever. In reality, they're there for just a few weeks or a few months, depending on the location. This particular rig is what we call a super single. It's part of our efficiency and optimization of the Marcellus. This is a rig, it's only 90 feet tall. It's a little more nimble. Again, based on any numbers of circumstances, we can use these sorts of rigs to drill the horizontal portion. It's a little bit smaller and it's a lot cheaper for us. That's important. It helps us reduce costs and efficiencies. From a community perspective, these wells are typically a little bit more welcome because they're only 90 feet tall. What we also do at these locations, we use special engineering technology based on how they're laid out. So the equipment, when we build it, we can push dirt to one side of the hill, put the engines on the other side of the hill so that it can work as a natural muffle of that sound. We do those engineering studies for each location to ensure that the noises that are heard on the location are not heard off of the location. This is an exciting and new feature at more and more Marcellus locations. And we're developing the Marcellus and it's being powered by the Marcellus. So the green pipeline that you see, that's a line that's already going to be in place when these wells are finished. That way we can apply what many call a green completion technique when the wells are done. They'll automatically flow into this pipeline. The exciting thing is because there's natural gas development already taking place in this area, we can reverse the pipeline and use it to actually power the drilling rig. So you'll see the gas comes out of the pipeline, and because we're in what we call a wet gas area, there's a scrubber over my other shoulder. That removes some of those liquids out of the gas stream so that the gas can flow into a conversion kit. This conversion kit is no different than what you might see in a natural gas vehicle. It's just a little bit larger. We use this liquefied natural gas to power the drilling rig in place of diesel fuel. Now that's good for operators because it lowers our costs because the fuel is cheaper, so we're incentivized to want to do this. But from an environmental perspective, it's obviously much, much cleaner because of the cleaner burning properties of liquefied natural gas as compared to diesel fuel. Now we're at a Marcellus Shale water impoundment. Water is an important part of developing a Marcellus Shale well, and that's because water is required in all facets of what we do, but predominantly in the next step, which is the hydraulic fracturing or completing of a well site. What we have behind us here is one of our impoundments. We have roughly a few dozen of these impoundments that canvass most of southwestern Pennsylvania. Believe it or not, these impoundments are all interconnected. Some of them have temporary pipeline, some of them have permanent pipeline, where the water can move from one impoundment to another. We call that water transfer. In other instances, depending on the circumstances, there may be trucks that come in and out of these impoundments. The impoundment behind me is highly regulated and tightly engineered to specific standards set forth here in Pennsylvania. And what that means is we have unique topography here in PA. We also have seasonal water conditions. All of that has to be taken into consideration. Much of our water, believe it or not, comes from the Ohio River. That water is then transferred throughout most of southwestern Pennsylvania. As you move up into northeastern portion of the state, much of that water comes from the Susquehanna River. Some water may come from other nearby water streams and sources, and again, that's a very closely regulated process. There's also about 25 to 30% of the water which is recycled from other water locations. That water recycling is, it's critical that you have these impoundments for water recycling. The water may be conditioned after it's done being used at a well site and temporarily stored in an impoundment. It's more than just a big man-made lake, although that's kind of what it looks like with this 15 million gallon impoundment behind me. But it has multiple layers of specifically designed geosynthetic material as well as plastic material, similar to what you might find in a landfill, to make sure that they don't leak. In between each one of those layers, we also have an electronic leak detection system. In real time, that can notify our staff if there is an unlikely leak. Even still, there is a catch basin that would collect any water or fluids that may leak and actually pump it back into that impoundment. Each one is staffed 24/7 by security. There's perimeter fencing around it, some of which, depending on the landowner, may have privacy slots in between. There's also migratory bird netting to ensure that no migratory birds land into a recycling impoundment. There's also quick connects for the trucks. What we had early on, and we learned this, that if the truck drivers throw the hoses into the impoundment, when they pull it out, they were tearing the liner. So what we made was a quick connect system to reduce and eliminate that potential. There's also specific designs around the impoundment to make sure that any stormwater runoff is appropriately managed. Again, this water can be transferred from each one of these impoundments, in some instances 10, 15 miles to the next location. The one right behind me has serviced approximately 20 different locations here in southwestern Pennsylvania. What does that mean to a citizen that lives in the community? Significantly decreased truck traffic. Because we can store it in the impoundment and move it via a temporary pipeline, those are less trucks on the road. The last portion of water management in Marcellus Shale development is how much water do you need? It's a question that we hear all the time. There's concerns, are you gonna suck all the water dry? The reality is this, the Marcellus Shale industry collectively makes up less than 1/3 of 1% of the state's daily water consumption. Pennsylvania is a very water-rich state. That doesn't mean that we can carelessly use the water, but it does put that into context. We are a very small consumer. For those of us that care about sustainable energy development over a long period of time, shale gas development, believe it or not, is the least water intensive of major forms of energy. So there's much less water required if you were producing a barrel of oil or coal or nuclear or biofuels, uses much, much less water. So again, these impoundments are specially designed, specially engineered, and they're routinely maintained and visited by staff on a daily basis. Another critical safety component for the environment that we include on recycling impoundments, which are designed slightly differently, we include groundwater monitoring wells. That's an engineered process, it's permitted, and there are 4 of those wells around this pad. So even if there is an unlikely chance that there's a leak, and it goes through 2 separate layers of containment, and it gets past the sub pump and past the electronic notification, there are groundwater monitoring wells that can identify us and indicate whether or not there was a spill or a leak that may have impacted groundwater. Again, that is incredibly rare and unlikely. But what's important to know for the public is that those safeguards are very much in place. Another important part of what we do are water management plans. All of these impoundments, as well as all of the water that we use, must be approved in advance by the state. There is then a cradle-to-grave process that includes how we use the water, where we stored it, if we recycled it, and then if we disposed of it, was it through an approved method? All of that is regularly manifested by the state as well. It's truly a cradle-to-grave process. Most operators in Pennsylvania are recycling 100% of the water that they use, and these impoundments play an incredibly important role. Now we're on an active Marcellus Shale frac job. The drilling rig has left, the rig that you saw that was here, that drilled those wells. It's broken down, it's moved on to the next location, and all the equipment you see here is now set up so that we can hydraulically fracture, or complete these wells. The first thing that we do is we lay down our spill containment and prevention throughout this location to make sure that in the unlikely event of a spill, nothing touches the environment. Now I'm going to walk you through step by step kind of what you're looking at. The most important step in this process is water. Where do we get that water from? The waters come typically from centralized impoundments. In the case of this well, that water travels 5, 6, maybe even 7 miles through temporary pipelines that's sent to this location. It's circulated around the back of the location and stored in smaller tanks. From that point, the water is then mixed in a blender, and it's mixed with the very large white silos that you see behind me. We call those sand silos. The reason why that's a new technology, it's very important. Because we're using silica sand that can create dust and other nuisance issues, and it can also, over long-term periods, there are some concerns for workers that are breathing in all that sand. What this technology does is it virtually eliminates that. So from a community perspective, it eliminates dust. Also, very importantly, at the top of those tanks, you'll notice that there's lights. What that does is that allows the lighting for the location to come from above and not from left to right. Now, why is that important? If you live near one of these locations and the light is traveling from side to side, it may distract you in the evening. We don't want that to happen. We want the light down from the sky shining onto these locations because it is a 24/7 process. This is a process that may take place anywhere from 1 week to several weeks, depending on the number of wells. Again, that water travels in, it's mixed in the blender with the sand, and we also use some chemical additives that are used in that process basically to keep the wellbore clean and to allow good viscosity when you're pumping that water. That also allows us to reduce our water needs. It travels from the blenders into what we call a manifold. People in the industry sometimes will refer to that also as a missile because of its shape. It's pumped into a low pressure side of that manifold where it's pressured up, then travels to the high pressure side before it is pumped through the irons up and into each Marcellus Shale well. That's then pumped down into the hole. Again, all of that is electronically and remotely monitored. Now again, we're always seeking for efficiency and effectiveness on these locations. So while you're fracking one well, you're preparing the next well next to it. What that does, that's allowed us to increase efficiencies over the years by a factor of 4 in certain aspects of what it is that we do. Now, before we move on, I want to spend a little bit of time just quickly talking about fracturing fluids. There's a lot of questions about fracturing fluids. What is it that we're putting into the wells? This technology that you see behind me has been around for about 60 years. Obviously, it's very different than it was 60 years ago. I like to think of it as the way cars looked 60 years ago. They were bigger, they were clunkier, they weren't as efficient. Now cars have state-of-the-art technology inside they're faster, they're more fuel efficient, and they're loaded with technology. Really the exact same thing is out here on this drilling well site. So what we use is a mixture that's 99.9% water and sand. The chemicals that we use on this job typically are 3 to 4 chemicals. And what we use is an antimicrobial agent. You've probably heard of that because it's on the side of a hand soap. We use that for the same reason why we use it on our hands. We want to kill bacteria that's in that wellbore. We would also use what's called a scale inhibitor. And again, that does exactly what it sounds like. It eliminates scaling from inside that well. Because if the scale builds up, it can choke off the production. We don't want that to happen. That's very similar to what you would use in the pipes in your home or what the municipal water company may use in their wells as well. And then last but not least is we may use a friction reducer. Again, this is just something that increases the pump rates. This is very similar. It's something that you might see in swimming pools or in other parts of our everyday life. Now I'll tell you, we don't recommend that anyone drink any of these 3 or 4 chemicals that we may use, but in their incredibly diluted forms, 99.9% water and sand, they pose no risk to human health. What's important is that they remain safe, that they're safely used, safely contained, and recycled when we're finished using them. So now, picture the frac job is started. What we want to do first is set the perforations in that steel pipe. Remember before we talked about all the steel and cement that's used in these wells to fully isolate those well bores. The question everyone always asks, how do you then get the water out of the pipe? So you picture that horizontal well bore is laying through the Marcellus Shale. We would drop down one of these, what we call a perf gun. You can see the little silver discs. That represents where the heat charges are going to go. That can then blast out a couple of feet to a few inches to a few feet into the Marcellus Shale. You can see they have them specially engineered and angled so that the water shoots into the shale precisely the way our engineers want it designed. So you picture that is dropped down into the first stage. We would then pump the water in through those holes. As we move on to our next stage, what you then see is what we call the frac plug. This is a specially designed piece of equipment. It gets lowered down into that first stage. So picture, you have a half a mile lateral length. This may get dropped down for the first few hundred feet. It gets set into place. And people always say, how do you control those fractures as you move into the next stage? Well, then we drop down what's simply referred to as a frac ball. That gets dropped down through the wellbore and sets into place. Believe it or not, this small piece of equipment is all it takes to control that fracture as we move on to the next stage. When we're finished and all of the stages have been set, a small drilling unit goes through and drills up these pieces. Believe it or not, this stuff actually comes back out. It's a recycled material, specially designed. It comes out basically looking like sawdust whenever we're finished. Well, we're getting a rare glimpse. We are up close and personal on what we call a frac stack. So you picture that drilling rig that was out here previously, drilling these 6 wells on this Marcellus Shale pad. That drilling rig was right here. So you can see the bottom of the frac stack, the blue portion. That's the first part of the well. That is exactly where that drilling rig was. If you were to follow that blue line, it would travel down a mile and a half, and then it would turn out and travel almost another mile in any particular distance through the Marcellus Shale. But what's important is safety, and that's really what we're looking at in a frac stack. If you move up to the first section, the red portion, that's a shutdown device. That can be shut down manually, or it can be shut down remotely from inside the frac van. You move up, there's a second red block. That's the backup to the emergency shutdown. But more importantly is that you have redundancies. So above that, we're required, and it's a practice that we obviously welcome for safety purposes, is you have the 3rd level of shutdown on these wells. So that's the backup to the backup of the shutdown. And then last but not least, we also have an emergency shutdown device that we also have on these wells. Now, what happens at this frac stack is the water and the sand that are pumped on the back of this location are shot down into these wells. It's a very precise technology and technique. It starts on the back of the location, and it travels through the irons. So these green lines that you see that go up into the frac stack, that's where the water and the sand actually travels. Again, it's high pressure, but it is very closely monitored and a very precise science. So what, again, you're seeing a frac stack up close and personal in the Marcellus Shale. Another important factor on a Marcellus Shale location is what we call spill prevention or containment. This is a mechanical process. As you can see, there's a lot of moving pieces and there's human beings involved. There is the potential for there to be a spill or a leak from any number of this equipment. But what's important is that we can engineer around that. We can plan for those unfortunate or unlikely circumstances. Not only are we required to turn anything over a gallon into state regulators, but we're also required to have all of the spill containment that you see out here on the location. A lot of it is technologies and techniques that evolve, so some of it is not required per regulation. As those techniques and technologies evolve, those best practices then become required regulation. So if you picture this drilling location, you have gravel, reinforced gravel at the base. We then put some sand down. On top of that, we have a geosynthetic material or a felt. So that's the first layer. Above that, you see this high density plastic liner that goes on top, this polyethylene liner. You can see even up close at the frac stack, at that well equipment, how tightly wrapped and controlled that spill containment is, because we don't want anything ending up on the ground. Last but not least are these drilling mats. These are just large containers, levels that we lay out throughout this location. You can see it extend all the way to the back. We do that for a number of reasons. First of all, we want to keep the equipment off of the spill containment so that you don't have a tear in that liner. Also, it's very good for worker safety. You can see the grip that's on there. It works on their boots. These guys are working long hours. We want to make sure that there's no slips, trips, or falls. Last, but certainly not least, what you also see at the containment, behind me you see the guys working, preparing for the job, but more importantly, you see that berm. Now what that is in the event of a spill or a leak, it can also be contained on this location. It cannot overset that berm. Again, safety is important. Spill containment and prevention is really the most important thing on any Marcellus Shale location. Now we're inside of the actual frac van. This is where all these months and in many cases years of planning really come to culmination inside this van. So we had a good look at around the location, all the activity that's going on, and now what we can really see is the high technology that's used to control a frac job here in Pennsylvania. And what you're looking at on the screens is that the crew that's working for Range Resources, at any given time, they can pretty much tell you what's going on at every step of the way. They know the pressures, they can control all of the trucks that we saw, they can control the blending rates, and more importantly, they can shut everything down remotely inside. And the reason why that's important is for worker safety. But also, what you're seeing here is state-of-the-art technology to make sure that these wells are completed not only efficiently, but effectively. We can maximize the amount of natural gas and natural gas liquids and condensate that's produced out of these wells, but we can increasingly increase productivity, and that's also very, very important. So if you look over my shoulder, you can see at any one of these screens, with a click of a mouse, they can control the actual pumps, they can shut things in remotely. And what you're looking at also is the different blending rates, the pressure, the depth, all of the critical information. Believe it or not, even though we're 1.5 miles deep beneath our feet right now, fracturing the Marcellus Shale, they can actually control that up here from the surface. And it's really the same sort of technology that would be used in any other high-tech form. So for instance, many of the technologies utilized in the space program are also utilized out here on a frac job in the Marcellus Shale. Behind me is an important part of what some people refer to as a green completion. It's a critical step. What we call it is just a good part of doing business. The reason why is after we're finished fracking or completing these wells, that water has to flow back out. We clean out the wells and you get oil and gas that comes out. So where does that go? You may have seen or heard of the need to flare some of that gas. That process may take a couple of days. What we're seeing now in a developed field is movement towards green completions. So what you see over my shoulder is the permanent equipment. We're able to construct this before we frack the wells. There's a pipeline that's already been laid in this area. So as soon as these wells are completed, they're able to flow back and immediately be turned on to production. There's no need to flare, and there's no need for any emissions of any sorts from these wells to flow directly back in to the final production. Now, when we're finished with the wells, people often ask questions, what did you pump in the wells? What was in the frack job? You can look that information up on frackfocus.org. You can also find those completion reports on a per well basis through the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. Now, Range is very, very proud because we were the first company in the United States in the summer of July 2010 to voluntarily disclose those chemicals on a per well basis that we use in the fracturing fluids. That's now commonplace. That's required regulation in the majority of large oil and gas producing states, and Pennsylvania has that as a required step as well. So if you're interested in more for that, the easiest way is to either go to rangeresources.com or go to frackfocus.org. Well, now we're on a producing Marcellus Shale natural gas location. The drilling's already taken place, the completion has taken place, and before we get to this step, we do what's called flowback. That's when the water that was pumped into the well comes back out. That's also when the initial testing of the wells is conducted. The wells get cleaned out, and then they get ready for final production. So what we see behind us really isn't a whole lot to see. And that's really kind of the point of what it is that we do. It's very small, the final footprint here, when we're all finished. Now, what you see on this location are a lot of bells and whistles to ensure that there are zero emissions coming off of these particular locations. Originally, this started off as approximately a 6-acre location that was basically that temporary work site taking place over the course of almost the last year. Now we're down to anywhere from about 1 to 2 acres. Now, what does that mean? That means that we're producing natural gas from 1 to 2 square miles and only temporarily disturbing about 1% of the surface. So the final footprint is very small. In fact, energy produced like the way you're seeing behind me is about the most efficient in terms of surface land use of any major form of energy. Now, what we're seeing are the wellheads immediately. That's where the drilling rig was, that's where the frac stack was, and now the final wellheads. Each well has its own separator because a little bit of that water comes back, but these are also what we call super rich wells. They're producing a lot of condensate or natural gasoline, for lack of a better term, and ultimately it is something that's used in our vehicles. So more than likely, if you're in Pennsylvania and you're driving a car in this area, it may have very well came from this particular location. Those separators separate the gas to the pipeline and the water and the condensate to the storage tanks. Now, vapors or emissions is a very important thing. Because you're holding hydrocarbons in a steel tank, it can build up pressure. That pressure has to release. For decades and decades, that was released atmospherically. But now what we found, because of new technologies and diligency by a lot of the companies that are involved in this, we have new technologies that are able to recover those vapors. So at the tops of each of those tanks, you can see specialty equipment that was designed to collect those vapors. So when the pressure releases, it is collected. It's then taken and re-injected back into the sales line. So there is no atmospheric release of any emissions of any sort from these particular locations. And like anything else, we have backup. So we also have what we call a vapor destruction unit that's also on location. So if it's unable to be reintroduced back into the pipeline, it's burned, which is the most efficient way of destroying those vapors. Each location is visited once or twice a day by a Range employee, or at least several times per week. And they literally go over every single connection and operating piece of equipment that you see on this location physically to look it over. They go through a checklist to ensure that everything's operating properly. The condensate is also removed from this location by a truck at a minimum at least once a week in a lot of these wells, as we're seeing. But because it's very early, it's still hard to say over the very, very long term. But they may get anywhere from a couple of truck visits per week to at least one a week. Another common question is, how much gas is actually being produced from these locations? If you looked at Range's most recently released public data at about 4,000 foot laterals, So you would picture each one of those 8.5-inch well bores, it goes down a mile and it goes out about a half a mile underneath all the hills that we see here. If you added that up, those 4,000-foot laterals are about 11 to 12 billion cubic feet equivalent of natural gas. So this entire pad over the next decade produces enough natural gas to fuel more than 250,000 homes, again, over the next decade. And that's just off of one of these locations. Another really common question that we hear all the time is, why do I see solar panels on natural gas locations? Solar panels are incredibly important. People think because we produce a fossil fuel that we somehow don't want renewable forms of energy like wind and solar. If the wind blew, we'd probably have windmills out here if they weren't so expensive. But the solar panels provide an excellent form of power generation because there's no three-phase power typically available out here in these more rural locations. So not only do we use solar power to be able to power this location, again, there's a lot of high-tech electronic equipment that's used out here to be able to shut down the wells remotely or measure the production. But we use a lot of that solar panel. And on the power generation side, in a macro sense, you can't bring on wind and solar in the United States without having available natural gas for backup power generation. So the symbiotic relationship between natural gas and renewables is from the beginning, right here at the wellhead, all the way through to final usage in your homes. Now we're in one of the really important steps of producing a Marcellus Shale well in southwestern Pennsylvania. This is the control room for Range Resources' Southern Marcellus Shale Division. This is a rare look. Not a lot of people get to see this. The individuals in this room in real time as we speak are looking at more than 500 of Range's wells that are here in southwestern Pennsylvania, which is currently the Marcellus, the largest producing natural gas field in the United States. And Range is one of the most active operators. So what you're seeing is one of the most active control rooms in the most active gas field in the United States. You have two controllers. One's looking at half of the operations. They can communicate with our external partners, and the other operator's looking internally. And then we have a lead operator that's kind of like the quarterback of the entire facility. These individuals are in here 24/7. But what's important is that they see every single well, every single thing that's taking place, and feeding into more than 15 compressor locations. Also, in the unlikely event of an issue, of an incident, of a mistake, of a problem, all of those things can be anticipated and, again, monitored remotely. At all of Range's locations, we have multiple redundancies in terms of being able to shut down equipment. Some of it will happen automatically. Other times requires confirmation in this room and then a person to physically go out and make that shutdown. So they can, again, they can look at every single well, more than 500 of them, feeding into 15 compressor station locations, which ultimately all feeds to the Mark West gas processing facility in Houston, Pennsylvania. There's also another one in Majorsville, West Virginia. Again, the folks in this room have to work diligently, closely to coordinate all of those field operations so that things operate safely and that people like you and I can turn the power and the lights on when we need it at home or cook our food when we need gas readily available. Well, you saw the whole process from the beginning to end on how we developed the Marcellus Shale here in Pennsylvania. Hopefully it answered a lot of questions, gave people an opportunity to see that not only are we developing this resource, supporting 250,000 jobs, but that we're doing it the right way with the utmost respect and appreciation for not only the communities but the environment. If you have more questions about this, please, by all means, go to rangeresources.com. Another excellent website is the marcelluscoalition.org. On behalf of everyone at Range Resources, thank you so very much for the opportunity to show you what it is that we do here in Pennsylvania.